Hello, and welcome to this interview with Melissa Schainker, one of our artists presently on display at the Beyond the Brush Oil and Mixed Media exhibition on display at the Alfa Art Gallery. My name is Peter Travers, and together we will be going over some of Melissa's artistic process, as well as a few of the pieces that were so thoughtfully contributed to both our physical and online presentations. Well, to start out, how are you doing today, Melissa?
Doing great. Just here in Tribeca trying to keep cool. It's really hot in the city today. So
It's quite warm here too. Glad to hear you're doing well. Moving into the more formal questions. A quick glance at your website says that you've been making art since you first learned to hold a pencil. But I was wondering if you could elaborate on why you decided to pursue it professionally and how you got started with painting, since your works currently on display use oil and acrylic as their medium.
So I started drawing and painting really since I could pick up a pencil. I did my first oil painting when I was 13 or 14 years old. I went to school actually for graphic design because you have to have some sort of fallback as a professional artist. But I did that for about a decade, and then kind of figured out that while I was doing something creative during the day, that I lost the drive to do it at night. I wouldn't make as much art because I was pouring my creativity into advertising art. So after my children were born, I stayed home with them for a few years and continued to make art the whole time. But I think it really picked up with my first exhibition in the city, which was around 2017. And then truthfully, 2020 is when my art got a lot more traction and started to be exhibited more regularly. And at that point, I was in enough shows to justify renting the studio and doing this full time, which has been a blessing, truly. This is what I always wanted to do.
All right, awesome. Interesting to hear your background and that you kind of experimented with a couple things for a while. Next up, the paintings you submitted for Beyond the Brush all share a common image of distorted human bodies, often alongside strong shades of red. Could you discuss your subject matter and explain the connecting theme of these works?
So a lot of my work follows a very similar style. I've always enjoyed painting people, painting from life. A lot of times it's self-portraiture. And 9 times out of 10, I'm trying to figure out what's going on in here. So that actually kind of explains the distortion. I think that in general, nobody has a really clear view of themselves, and we distort our own realities a bit. So I kind of do that quite literally in the forms, whether it's a very, very intentional or very subtle distortion. I think that that makes it more interesting. If I were trying to do hyperrealism, I would do photography. I kind of think that there's something stronger, at least to me, about work that takes painting and uses it as a medium to explore the imagination. As far as the use of red, I'm a big fan of red, but I also really like things that surprise the viewer in a piece. I want to kind of shock the system in one way or the other, whether it invokes anger, whether it invokes love. Red is one of those colors that always creates a strong emotion one way or the other. I've had a lot of people ask, well, why are your paintings bleeding? They're not necessarily. Sometimes it's just a red being used in a way to draw attention to a particular part of a figure. But it's always interesting to hear what others' interpretation of my work are too.
That is interesting. I kind of expected, like, I mean, I see red in bodies, I think blood, so
I mean,
yeah.
that's the common theme. And honestly, sometimes it is blood, but for the most part, I'm not trying to create a dismembered figure. I really want to show that there's a highlight of this, and red, it invokes emotion, whether it's sanguine and blood or, love or whatever it may be.
Moving on now, all of the works you submitted for this exhibition are oil based, with one exception, Kindred, which is acrylic paint on canvas. The painting itself is also pretty unique, as it features a lot of blue in contrast to red, and the change in medium highlights this uniqueness. I was wondering if you could maybe go into detail about why you chose acrylic for this piece.
So it's interesting because generally when I work in acrylic, it's for a live painting. So this piece was done at an exhibition that I did with a group of artists that are all from Venezuela. They had a show out in Queens and they asked me if I would come and live paint. So whenever I'm doing a live painting, obviously oil, I can't sit there for a month and do a live painting. It's not going to be a good thing. So I'll either do something, this was in particular, this piece was done inside space, but sometimes I'll do acrylics out on the street where I'll have a canvas in front of an exhibition. So I tend to work in acrylic when it's necessary for something to dry quickly. I was actually exploring a new relationship in this piece. So it was kind of reaching out to this new person in my life and, you know, showing the immediacy and kind of the initial attraction of a brand new and exciting relationship. And that's the theme of it. And the reason it's acrylic is just for the way it was created.
That's really interesting. It does kind of stand out from the rest, so now we know why. Do you have any specific source of inspiration, especially for the works you submitted for us? Or did you have a specific feeling or thought you wanted the audience to feel when viewing them?
I'd love to see what others interpret, but a lot of times when I'm creating a piece of work, I'm trying to figure out and come to terms with whatever's going on inside my own mind. I think as a visual artist, I don't think I'm alone in this. A lot of times my thoughts or emotions come to me in a visual way more than a verbal way. So if I'm feeling a particular way, I'm really not great at telling somebody that. I'm like, all right, hang on, let me draw a picture. 9 times out of 10, my work is fueled by anxiety. I'm an anxiety sufferer. I have learned to cope with it over, you know, my entire life, but art is actually a really good way to channel that into a productive means. So mostly it's kind of almost always, and these pieces are no exception, I'm working through whatever anxiety, whatever is fueling me at the moment and getting it out on canvas so then it no longer torments the artist.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Among all the works you have submitted for Beyond the Brush, is there one that either is your favorite or least favorite?
Well, it's always hard to pick favorites in your work because you're moving through a lot of different things. And I've taught myself over the years of doing this professionally never to tell anybody if you have one you don't like, because as artists, we're kind of meant to tear apart our own work. And we absolutely do that. Every time I see a piece, I find 10 things wrong with it. But art doesn't sell if you tell people what's bad about it. I want it to speak for other people. But amongst the pieces that are in this exhibition, I was particularly happy with how The Agony of Waiting turned out. And for anybody looking at this interview, you'll of course have to go see the show to see the piece, but it's a very drawn back hand and there's an eye and it's kind of, I don't know, I think as a visual person to show emotion, sometimes I will often show like somebody clawing out an eye or covering an eye because I actually think that hands tend to tell more about the emotive state of a person than eyes. People tend to lie with their eyes. If you're actually watching somebody gesture, they're much more honest with their hands than they realize. So for that, I was pleased with how the hand turned out and how dramatic it was. And I feel like that conveys the emotion of waiting for someone to figure something out or really just waiting in general. I don't think any New Yorker, as myself, we're not particularly patient people. So that is a common theme, and at least it resonates in this work.
Thanks for sharing. Last question now. For anyone interested in pursuing art into the professional space, what advice do you have for them that you wish you had back when you were first starting out?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I would say if you're interested in pursuing art, you need to have a thick skin and you need to be really resilient because you will have to continue to put yourself out there continually. But the one thing I think that would be most poignant and helpful for me as a younger artist, if I had known at that time, would be to make a little bit of art every day. I think that every artist goes through ups and downs where there's blocks or moments where you aren't creating something you feel good about. And I think that, like any art form, music, art, cooking, whatever it is, with continued practice, we improve our craft. So even if you're making terrible art, putting something out there each day builds you up, gets you through the momentum, and kind of becomes a habit so that you're creating a body of work. And it's funny, there are often times where I create work that I hate, don't want to show anybody, and I'll still put it out there or exhibit it. And I've often sold works that I thought were terrible. So you never know how something you create will speak to someone else. So you have to kind of make something and then let go of it and see where it falls.
Thank you very much. At this time, I have no further questions for you, but if there's anything you want to talk about or any, part of your creative process or anything you'd like to touch on about your works, now is the time.
Well, all I will say is that I hope to see some of you all tomorrow. I'm planning to come down to the gallery for the in-person opening. I'm excited to see the rest of the works. I see some beautiful pieces behind you, and yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But as far as the process, I think that's individual and different for every artist. So, but yeah, looking forward to the opening tomorrow. And really, thank you so much for having me in the show and taking the time to talk to me about my work.
No, it was our pleasure. Melissa Schainker, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And I would like to take a second to thank our sponsors for NBAS 2022, Amboy Bank, Johnson & Johnson, Magyar Bank, the MCCHC, the New Brunswick City Center, and Merck Pharmaceuticals.